we hear? Huh. Things sound a little echoey. Some large vaulted place. Some kind of a rumble of a machine. Yeah, churning. Some doors opening. There's some footsteps, so people are walking around. Maybe some, oh, I think there might have been some keys jangling. Someone's going somewhere with some keys or something small. Something shifted. Now, this is an example of setting your setting. There's a large machine or something being rolled around. There's metal. Maybe it's a big vaulted castle or tower or some place that echoes. Sounds very hollow. And we're getting a feeling of where we are at from the music. Now, we need to be able to describe this in words as a storyteller, a GM or a DM. And this is a good exercise. In fact, here's another one that I like using too. Okay. Crickets, it's nighttime. Well, there's an owl too. This might be summer, maybe even sometime in the autumn. A lot of conversation, but it's not loud. Maybe some, small crowd. People milling about. A door opened and conversation got louder. Someone just went into a tavern. Okay. So people are using horses or carriages. There's a town watch. We just hit a bell. Is it 1 a.m. or the half-hour mark? I don't know. It's up to you to describe in your story. But it does have a calmness to it, right? This is great. This is great for helping to set your scene, to reinforce your setting, because that is the backdrop to whatever's happening. It's a constantly shifting tool set that the characters can use or have used against them. It is also going to help you establish your cultural norms and will help you decide on certain manifestations of magic, technology, art, food, other pieces of culture, religion. And in this instance, it doesn't sound like this place is at war. It's a calm night. But I bring this up now. We're going to shift away from this because we're going to be talking about Grimdark. That was the theme that was chosen. Pardon me. That was the theme that was chosen last night. And we need to develop that now. We have to take it in a forward direction. Jeez. Oh, a fountain turned on. Oh, wait. I don't think that's a fountain that... I don't think that's a fountain that turned on. Someone might have just stumbled out of a bar. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about Grimdark and dark fantasy and how we're going to develop our setting, okay? Ah, the world of fantasy literature, a realm brimming with noble heroes, wondrous magic, and epic battles, fought for the very fate of existence. But let's face it, sunshine and rainbows can get a tad boring after a while. Enter dark fantasy and grimdark, the genres where shadows are more than welcome, and heroes sometimes turn out to be not so heroic after all. So let's take a macabre stroll through these murky subgenres and try to unravel their wickedly delightful differences. Grimdark fantasy, a land where morality took a holiday. Grimdark fantasy is the darker, grittier cousin of traditional fantasy. In this world, chivalry and honor are as rare as a dragon sighting in the Piccadilly Circus. Forget about the valiant knight in shining armor. In Grimdark, even the heroes are morally ambiguous or downright corrupted. Characterized by its nihilistic tone and morally gray characters, Grimdark revels in the harsh realities of life. Expect plenty of blood, gore, and political intrigue with a healthy side of cynicism. Happy endings? Ah. A prime example of Grimdark would be George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, which gave birth to the acclaimed television adaptation Game of Thrones. The series is notorious for its ruthless, Machiavellian characters, think Cersei Lannister or Littlefinger, as well as its tendency to kill off beloved characters with little more than a shrug. But you should have seen it coming, casting Sean Bean as a hero. Good old Sean Bean. And let's not forget Joe Abercrombie's The First Law trilogy, where the line between heroes and villains is so blurred, you'd need a bloody magnifying glass to find it. Now, this might sound a lot like noir or pulp, and you're not necessarily incorrect. In fact, many of you out there also might think of, especially, Warhammer 40,000, right? In the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. And the Imperium of Man is not a happy place. It is, you find such extremes that even the extremes themselves are almost just itself qualifying for the fantastic in the fantasy. But of course you have psychers using magic and other things, and of course there is technology. Maybe it's a good fusion of sci-fi and fantasy together. In D&D terms, Grimdark might be closer in setting to Eberron, the concept of Eberron. But let's continue, because you all might have other recommendations or suggestions. Now, dark fantasy, a marriage of shadows and magic. Dark fantasy, on the other hand, is a genre that blends together elements of fantasy and horror. Its stories are draped with an ominous atmosphere, often delving into themes of supernatural terror, darkness, and the macabre. While Grimdark is more concerned with its morally gray cast and a general sense of hopelessness, dark fantasy focuses on creating a chilling, eerie world where monsters lurk and nightmares come to life. Take, for instance, Clive Barker's Weave World, a novel that expertly weaves together magical realms and monstrous beings, painting a vivid yet terrifying picture of a world on the brink of annihilation. Or how about Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles? This series gives us a dark and brooding world inhabited by immortal bloodsuckers, exploring themes of loneliness, immorality, and the seductive nature of evil. Lestat de Lioncourt, the series' charming yet ruthless vampire anti-hero, is a perfect example of dark fantasy's penchant for complex characters who tread the line between light and dark. And dark fantasy might often be where you would find much more of the classic horror. Not that you can't find a body in, some sort of gruesome description in a grimdark setting, as, violence happens. But it's not necessarily the shock of, a body. It's that loud crack of the gun or whatever, the weapon, and the vivid arterial spray, and then how the characters say, well, all right, problem solved, let's keep moving. And you get that interesting juxtaposition where we should recoil and scream or call for help or something, and instead it's actually just business as usual. Tropes, themes, and novels to sink your teeth into. So, to sum it up in a delightfully morbid nutshell, Grimdark is a subgenre that thrives on moral ambiguity, gritty realism, and a sense of unrelenting bleakness. This is societal horror. Sociological horror. Dark fantasy, on the other hand, is a marriage of fantasy and horror, with a heightened focus on supernatural terrors and the darker aspects of human nature. So there we might get more into psychological horror, one's personal horrific battles, or the waves of terror that crash against the person there. It's not necessarily society that is the problem, or the iron fist held over everyone. It might be more centered on the hero or anti-hero or villain, in a sense. For those with a penchant for all things sinister... Oh, I'm sorry, hang on. I skipped a line here. But why choose between these two delightfully shadowy subgenres when you can have both? For those with a penchant for all things sinister, here are a few novels that dabble in both grimdark and dark fantasy. The Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steve Erickson, the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence, the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski, and The Witcher came up in conversation last night. Heretic, were you the one who brought it up? Or I know that you commented that you did read it, because I had to, and yep, okay. Whether you prefer the blood-soaked, morally bankrupt world of Grimdark, or the spine-tingling chills of dark fantasy, one thing's for certain, in the realm of shadows, there's never a dull moment. Happy reading, and try not to lose your way in the darkness. This is a very good summary. And you may find in your own writing, and even in this pursuit, we know we're aiming for Grimdark. Will there be moments of terror or horror? Yes. Does that violate Grimdark? No. It still can be. as you know, there's not necessarily the one true way forward, correct? Or you might read something that is it's generally presented as this, but of course there's little splashes here and there of some other types of writing. But we have our lighthouse on the horizon, as actually dark as it is. Ooh. There's a couple other things I want to go over, and then we'll have our workshop exercise together here. Now, there's a lot more here than just the blurb I'm going to read, but I like providing the links to you all here. As we're discussing the setting, how your fantasy world determines your story. And remember, world building in any fantasy. It could be lighthearted, comedic, Princess Bride, or we can, delve into, the war-torn world of The Witcher, with various monsters and just bad stuff that happens, right? The rifts and the way that the people treat the Witchers and all this other stuff. There's a lot there. But this is all a part of the world building. Because remember, fantasy, especially fantasy, is an escape from the world we know. We know we have bills to pay. We know that there are societal woes that exist. We know that there's whatever, economic things or personal things that you're going through. But maybe for just one more chapter, one more half hour, one more page, whatever it is, we can step out knowing that we are willfully, gleefully abandoning the real for the speculative what if. Going into a world where our monsters are not metaphorical. The things that haunt us or concern us. Where they are very much, there are very much monsters. The monster under the bed isn't some, quaint, realistic term that we use in some other way. There is an actual monster under the bed. And this is, in a sense, too, why we do get some bleed over from the realistic, that IRL place. I don't know. 5 out of 10 might suggest on occasion. But ultimately, why it can be distasteful when those who are presenting fantasy as a form of escapism and entertainment anchor it with obvious ties to real things. Because then it's not a fantastic world where, we're caught up in the unknown and it's a challenge to learn. Our brains are built to learn, adapt, observe, comprehend, piece things together. And it makes the happy juice in our brains when we do. It's a great natural source of happy juice. But when all of that is stripped away by a creator, but a writer or some other novelist or something else, by saying it's none of that and it's actually this real issue, the happy juice dries up. There's no mystery. There's nothing to unravel or uncover. All right, so why should I watch this movie, this TV show? Why should I read this book? You've already spoiled that it's actually it's nothing more than, you talking about this thing. That is a very real thing. I don't want real. I want things that take me away from it. So we need to make sure that even though it's grimdark, and sometimes our lives might feel grimdark, that it is still a fun, it's a fun read. It is something that might feel compelling or have that sense of mystery or just that fantasy to it, that we are transporting our readers into this other world. So what kind of features will impact the way your world works? Well, for example, a resource-rich region could mean a wealthy culture, or one that's constantly under threat as others want the wealth for themselves. Or, if you're writing science fiction, you might decide you have wormholes that allow faster than light travel, or that the inhabitants live in vast megastructures or in the atmosphere of gas giants. Seemingly small decisions can have an outsized effect on the fabric of your entire novel. These aren't just constraints, they're opportunities for new stories too. Have fun here, but create with intention. Your choices will affect your writing in fundamental ways. If you create a huge landmass for a secondary world fantasy, your characters may have to travel hundreds or thousands of miles by horseback. What are they doing during this time? What are the other characters up to? And how are you showing all of this to the reader? Unexpectedly, a single choice regarding the geography of your world could mean your story takes place over years rather than weeks. Similarly, if you don't have FTL, then you'll have to consider time dilation and the centuries it takes to cross interstellar space. However, these aren't just constraints. They're opportunities for new stories too. One example comes to mind right away. Joe Haldeman's The Forever War uses time dilation to brilliant effect. Now, there are other parts of this article, and I would suggest reading it over. And we're going to get to magic and technology, magic systems and such. But that was the one I wanted to focus on the most for this current workshop. We've gone over what is the fantasy genre. This is the one that does talk about dark fantasy, and just something, as if we need to go back as a review. Now, what about yes, TV tropes? TV tropes has some very good articles to read and consider. Oh, Pokeniner, hello! Good to see you again, my friend. And by the way, there is another similar article for standard fantasy setting, and then there's one. It was like standard Japanese fantasy setting, and this is kind of that what is the average Western European late Middle Ages, early Renaissance style kind of sweet spot a lot of fantasy falls into. The generic fantasy setting, high fantasy, heroic fantasy, and low fantasy are usually set here, along with many tabletop RPGs and video games. However, this is not required. This is newer than they think. Trope maker of The Lord of the Rings, though written earlier, only developed a cult following in the 60s. Dungeons and Dragons beginning in 1974 and The Sword of Shannara in 1977, or the 1977 first novel by Terry Brooks, acted as trope codifiers. Another trope maker is William Morris, who wrote many such works in the 1890s. 4 were reprinted by Ballantyne's adult fantasy series. That series is another likely trope maker itself. So something comes out, yeah, I can go along with that, and it kind of piles on, and the works, offer breadth and depth. So people say, yes, that may be generic Western Europe, late medieval period, but here's my generic Western European late medieval period. And then another person says, here's my generic Western European late medieval period. And now there's 100 works that are, that seem to be the common setting, with just the one difference sort of a thing. Post-Tolkien, this usually has at least 3 of the standard fantasy races of heroic peoples: dwarves, elves, humans. Any of the above called by a different name is allowed. And there's also other fantastic sapient species tropes. And then we get into we get into, well, it's more the individual nature of why people might play a certain type of character. Is there a general, maybe a demographic or some sort of an infographic we can make about people who tend to play tieflings or male human fighters in every game, or those who are furries or scalies, who prefer dragonborn or shifters or other styles of character. We all have reasons. We have our preferences, and this is not shaming anyone who's into that stuff. But it can play into things as you are. Maybe you're leaning into the things that you really like, and you can confidently develop. If you are a furry, you may very well be able to write a more vivid society regarding, to us as humans, animalistic people, than someone who just sticks to, well, it's humans, and maybe there's like some mutants, but they're mostly human. They're only mostly human. So give this a look over. There's a lot to read about building a generic fantasy setting. This is a great starting place. It could be tongue-in-cheek, and you can also find a lot of good references. And we can go over to, yes, the fantasy world map. And by the way, for these next two maps, I am just as guilty as anyone else. I am not calling anyone out nor dragging anyone down. If any of you either want to put your hand up and go, yo, that's me, or if you kind of go, oh, that's me, you can do that. But I'm not calling anyone out. I'm simply saying we tend to fall into some tropes. Maps of fantasy worlds have been a feature of fantasy books ever since L. Frank Baum's Land of Oz. A visual reference can be very handy. Often drawn an elaborate script pointing out the doomed hometown, the good kingdom, the empire, various fantasy counterpart cultures. Not China, not Japan, not Middle East, not Africa, that sort of a thing. Each of the standard fantasy races lands, many of the wacky wayside tribes, the dangerous forbidden zone, and the enchanted forest, alongside multiple florid warnings that here there be dragons. Diana Wynne Jones's The Tough Guide to Fantasyland has a few things to say on the subject of maps, including the fact that if you're on a quest, you may expect to visit every single place marked on them. Convenient, that, right? Fantasy world maps will often have roughly the proportions of a standard book page, so that all the places in the fantasy world can fit conveniently on the map. The law of cartographical elegance. Really deluxe worlds are proportioned like 2 pages side by side, thereby indicating they are a hardcover edition with end papers. Fantasy world maps sometimes also have a tendency to make it seem as if the world is literally flat. If the ocean is on the left side of the map, then it's a left-justified fantasy map. If the northern regions are cold and the southern regions are warmer, it's north is cold, south is hot. When the map doesn't make any geographical sense, it's a patchwork map. Though these can sometimes be sometimes justified by the use of magic. A variation occurs when maps of real places are included in a novel where it helps follow the intrigue. Sometimes, by the way, if any of you have ever read, why am I dropping on his name? He wrote the Zanth books. Oh my gosh! Speaking of fantasy and like prolific fantasy writers, help me, chat. Who wrote the Zanth? Xanth. The fantasy world that's totally not Florida. with Lake Ogre Chobi. Bleh. His name is... No. Piers Anthony, thank you. Thank you, Heretic Trance. Now, Piers Anthony leaned into the fact that Xanth is not Florida. And it was successful for it. That's kind of what that point over there was getting to. Sometimes complicated by opaque library book covers that cannot be removed from the book. In that case, there will forever be one side of the map that you cannot see without breaking the book cover. Though if you're lucky, the map will be on the inside of both the front and back covers, covering up the left and right sides respectively. This may help explain why, with a little monster powered by evil source you're getting closer to in order to remove handwave explanation, you can't just acquire a boat to kill the sea monster now that the sea storm that it entered by is over. Also frequent tabletop games for gameplay reasons, and occasionally an anime series for video game subtropes, and there's more here. Here is the link. Enjoy. So, if you feel called out, it's fine. You are not being called out. These are tropes for a reason. They exist for reasons that we often ubiquitously see them. Because it is how we had operated in the past. It's a convenient thing to just lean into and say, well, everyone before me has done it this way. I might as well do it too, because whether or not it's real, it's what is accepted. And then, my friends, I bring to you one of the best maps ever created. This is one of the most compelling fantasy lands. Welcome to Clicheia. These once great and original lands filled with hope and interesting new ideas have fallen to the Dark Lord. From his dark throne he sends forth hordes of evil creatures to blight the land. But there is a small hope. The Chosen One must rise up and defeat the Dark Lord, if the land, now known as Clicheia, is to be restored to its former glory. And so, of course, we have the very temperate, not too hot in the south, not too cold in the north, the Northern Shire, the village of the unlikely hero. Agrarian, peaceful. You know, leaves everyone else alone. However, adventure's going to call the unlikely hero to Liongard, city of protagonists. And of course, to get to Liongard, city of protagonists, we must we must go through the Kingwood Forest and cross the Great River over the river bridge. After we pass through Gondar, the land that's just right. Now, if we wish, we can visit Old Town. Or we might be sent from there somewhere else. Perhaps the Dragon's Lair. Something's happening that could threaten the home of the unlikely hero. But we can't cross the World Scar just yet. Or survive in the Badlands, the land that's too sandy. So we gotta do a little leveling up, right? So maybe we're sent as war is brewing, or we need to amass the troops. Liongard, city of protagonists, needs someone to go to Vikingheim in order to convince the Vikings there, in the north, of course, on the fjords, to come and help. So maybe we take the Great River through the Kingwood Forest. Like, we could skirt around it. We stayed to the open plains, right? We crossed the bridge, but now we have to go into the Kingwood Forest, past the Mountains of Mist, to Vikingheim. But there, they too are in need of help. And going over the pass is not possible because of Storm Bay, where there's always a storm, and of course the Maelstrom, which has actually protected Liongard from the Dark Tower in Gothmore, the land that's too dark. And so, to get the Vikings' help, we need to go and do something else. And so we go to Forgehold, City of Dwarves, in the Mountains of Mist. And there we meet with the dwarves of the Mountains of Mist. And we adventure with them to settle something in Kazakrad, the largest mountain. And at which case, that's about time in the story that we come back. Now we have dwarves, and now we have Vikings, and then we come back to Liongard, and then it's off to the Badlands, because the dwarves might build us a bridge. So, before we do that, we make our way to Old Town, right across from Land's End, because who knows, there may be dragons out here, to provision and supply, run a couple side quests. And then we come back as the dwarves have already set up, like they just came down this way, boop, and we had a side quest to do. Then we come over to the World Scar, and we have our way around as we can now survive in the desert, making our way in the land that's too sandy, to Rajashi, the exotic city. And this is probably where the cat people or the, whatever, the elephant people or, something, tiger people, this is where they live, clearly. The dragon people, who they themselves are afraid of the dragon's lair. But we must go and find out what's happening, because if the dragon wakes up, what's the first place that might get attacked? Maybe not Rajashi, which might be used to living by the dragon, but it would be the Northern Shire, then blazing across Gondar, the land that's just right, all the way to Lionsguard, City of Protagonists. And so we make our way there, having to pass through the bandit camp. We go through the Reach, over the Dragon Tail Islands to the lair, only to find out that, the dragon might not actually be as upset as we thought, or rather is upset at something else, and will help us if only we help the dragon. For you see, the dragon's mate up in the frozen northern wastes, the land that's too cold, is in trouble. And if we help the dragon can carry us across the Maelstrom, over Storm Bay, to eventually take on the forces of darkness in Gothmore. And so now we head back. Maybe we head across, or we visit everyone back at the Northern Shire. We make our way over the Great Plain to the massive wall and the breach in the massive wall, holding back the cold and the denizens of the frozen north. Now, we were warned by the dwarves when we were visiting Kazakrad that Asgard is a very precipitous place. And we make our way there, trudging. Are the people that are going to care? We might die on our march. We get there to find perhaps the elves. The elves of Asgard are not exactly what we had hoped. But they're going to work with us if only we can help them. And what do we help them with? It would be convenient for writing. We have to go back to Kazakrad with an elven device to open a door that even the dwarves couldn't. Cursing the elves initially, back when we were like level 2 or 3. And now we go back there and we revisit that place. And we do the thing that the elves wanted. And then the elves stop doing the thing that was pissing off the dragon. And now the dragon comes back and says, all right, it's time to cross. Now the entire western continent has opened up to us because we might have an airship. We might be able to ride on a dragon or several dragons. We have alliances to help us with river travel, sea travel. We have expert guides through the mountains and the forest and over the lands. And now what do? It's time to take on the Dark Tower. But this is traveling to the strange new world. For it turns out Asgard does have elves. But maybe they were the bitter ones, or the ones because they were expelled from Elvenhome. What? We thought the whole time Asgard had elves. But look. Elvenhome. In these ancient lands. The land that's too perfect. And hence we find out that we were cut off the whole time by the elves who were too perfect, too haughty and proud. Didn't want any of us standard fantasy races, even though they might qualify. But we make our way there to try and desperately plead. So we go over the pass, we visit the Stones of Prophecy, we stop by Star Lake, we pass by Yggdrasil, the big tree. Finally, to Lith Lenore in Elvenhome. And there, we must do a thing. And then they'll help. Now coming with dwarves and humans and cat people and a dragon? Finally, the army can amass on the battle plane. The battle plane of Gothmore. And as we march, there must be a dramatic twist. From the dark forest, a horde of enemies tries to make a counterattack straight at Lith Lenore. And so the army must split up. In fact, the army has to go back and face off the other army. But what if a group of heroes was able to infiltrate Gothmore while the army was distracted? Brilliant. I'm glad I thought of it. That's my idea. And so the party continues its southern, it's getting hot by the way because we're going south again, its southern journey by the Blackwater, through the dark forest, by the Blackwater, to the Shadow Mountains where there is Mount Death. Mount Death casting its eerie lights over the Black Sea. And finally, after defeating probably 4 generals, it's time to make that final push to the Dark Tower. And there, maybe with the army having defeated the darkness behind us and is able to march in our party's footsteps, there is now the big final push. The heroes might throw down the Dark Lord of the Dark Tower of Gothmore, the land that's too dark, by the Dark Forest, by the Black Sea, by Blackwater Lake, and the Shadow Mountains. And we win. And there, from there, with the boats and the airships and the dragons and everything else, maybe there's some, I don't know, there's a merfolk or something here that, we're working for the evil guy and we change their hearts or something. We then conveniently cross back over from the Dark Tower to Liongard, the city of protagonists. Victorious. And maybe, if we don't choose to stay in Liongard, we might go home, passing through Gondar, the land that's just right, back to the Northern Shire. And thus our story is complete. Our beautiful, original fantasy world has been explored, has been described. Now, by the way, Hoylepa, I'm glad that you like that impromptu storytelling jam that we just had. I think that would be very interesting, Rep Artist. Now, if you go, oh, I get it, fine, it's cliche. It's fine to be cliche. That's the whole point of something like this. What did I just describe? I described what? Lord of the Rings? I described Star Wars? I described what? Conan the Barbarian? What else did I describe? So many. And now, the names have changed. But in many stories, there's always the Badlands. There's always the Gondar and the Gothmore. And it's fine to have a Gondar and a Gothmore. But you'll find that these locations are the same. Even if the stories would differ or the order of things. But there we go. Hopefully this was, a good, a good way to understand setting. And also, as we go through here, as you're doing fantasy world building, what is the magic like? What are the economies like? What are the resources like? What do we learn? Do we learn a new spell in Vikingheim? And we learn a new spell in Forgehold that neither Vikingheim nor even Liongard had? It's all a part of the exploration in the world. As you get into the magics that exist and the monsters that are fought. And while this is the obvious pointing out of the cliche, it's okay when you're planning your fantasy world. Now, our challenge is, how do we turn cliché into a dystopian grimdark setting? And you might go, well, clearly Gothmore is the grimdark setting. I don't know, maybe. I mean, lawful good doesn't mean lawful nice. Liongard might have some really punitive laws. You know? There's nothing saying that Grimdark has to take place in Gothmore. Now, this would be a very obvious choice, but we can just as well have a Grimdark setting in Liongard, the capital of Gondar. Why not? The tone might be different, but there's still that kind of oppression or that, that lackadaisical, that attitude of, well, nothing really matters. We can have our dystopia, our grimdark setting in the Badlands, the lands that are too sandy. Heretic Trent says there has to be a Gothmore. Where else can I live? Well, when we build our setting here in this next part, we will discuss what our effective Gothmore will be. But let's get up and stretch. Let's and I'm gonna get things set up, because when we're in our second part here, there's a couple little review things I want to go over. I want to show you some little clips from pop culture to help prime our imaginations. Then we're going to go through a world building, a setting creating exercise using the core rule books of D&D. So bread and butter stuff, stuff that you should have access to, and if not, follow along. And this is going to be very participatory. So give me about 5 minutes, everyone. Give me about 5 minutes, and I will. I'll get up. I'm going to stretch, walk around. I shall refresh myself. Hashtag not sponsored, but man, this ginger cranberry is really good stuff. Oh, okay. I will be sure to do that, Heretic Trance. So give me about 5 minutes, everyone, and I'll be right back.